Our next panel will discuss our legal system. There's a lot of talk these days about things getting more expensive or the built-in cost of why things are expensive. Our next panel is going to discuss part of the reason that our health care is more expensive, that our cars are expensive, the things that are built into the cost and how we fix it. Because of the way, particularly in Pennsylvania, our legal system, jury awards, and out-of-control judges. So we're going to talk a little bit about tort reform and fixing our legal system. First, we're fortunate to have today Matt Fullenbaum. Matt is the Vice President for Legislative Affairs and Strategy at Americans for Tort Reform. In essence, he's the national expert who wakes up every day trying to help make sure that in Washington, and just important as in states like Pennsylvania, we fix our legal system so that it works for all of us, including consumers. We're fortunate to have Matt with us today. Joining Matt is our friend Curt Schroder. As many of you know, Curt is from Chester County, where he previously served as a state representative and had interesting novel ideas like the budget should be balanced, tax dollars should be spent wisely, and the legal system should be a friend to consumers and not the enemies. He has now poured that passion as the CEO and president of the Pennsylvania Coalition for Justice Reform. He has dedicated himself and his life's work now to making sure that out-of-control courts are reined in so that the things you and I need in our homes and buy are not more expensive in Pennsylvania, and so that our doctors don't leave this state, so that life returns to normal. Ladies and gentlemen, two friends for consumers, two friends of liberty, two friends of the free enterprise system. Welcome to the stage, Matt Fullenbaum and Curt Schroder.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that great introduction, Guy. As Guy said, I'm Curt Schroder, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Coalition for Civil Justice Reform. Now, I want to stress that's not criminal justice reform. A lot of people get us confused, which is understandable. But we tend to look at and try to reform civil actions, personal injury cases. When you get sued because something happens at your business or at your home. So we try to level the playing field for defendants so that they're not victimized by plaintiffs' attorneys and the court. And joining me today is Matt Fullenbaum of ATRA, the American Tort Reform Association. And Matt, why don't you tell us what the American Tort Reform Association is all about? I assume it's not reforming desserts or anything,
No.
right? Okay.
The American Tort Reform Association, we're a national organization that focuses on fighting lawsuit abuse and working with groups like Curt's in Pennsylvania and his counterparts all over the country to fight the trial lawyers. They're very powerful, they're very influential, and so we need groups like Curt's, PCCJR, to fight that fight, and we're here to provide support, thought leadership, identify issues that then those of you on the ground can take and run with to tackle and to fight the trial lawyers, because they are very, very powerful.
In fact, Matt, ATRA recently gave Pennsylvania courts a very dubious honor and distinction. Why don't you explain what that is?
Right, so every year we put out a report that looks at the worst courts in the country. And for 2 years in a row now, and I think for the 12th time overall in the report's history, we've been publishing this report for 20 years, Philadelphia and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court came in as the #1 judicial hellhole in the country. Why is it a judicial hellhole? What is a judicial hellhole?
Got to be proud, I'll tell you.
Those are places where judges are biased in favor of plaintiffs, where the juries often are biased in favor of plaintiffs, and where it's hard for you as a defendant to receive a fair trial and to receive justice. And so our organization, my organization, publishes this report, and we looked at Philadelphia in particular in the Supreme Court, and there are a number of problems coming out of Philly, which Curt and I are going to talk about, and some other issues in the Commonwealth.
We know, Matt, we really are caught in a trap here in Pennsylvania, and it's a trap that has been made and set by, I would say, both the Pennsylvania Supreme Court as well as the legislature, because the courts and the legislature these days see our court system as an avenue for socialist-style redistribution of wealth. To them, that's what our courts have become, taking from the productive sector of Pennsylvania, taking from our industrial might, our commercial industries, whatever our health care industries, and giving that money in mass amounts over to plaintiffs' lawyers in the form of their contingency fees. Now look, we believe, and I think we can all agree, that if someone is legitimately injured or aggrieved, they have a right to be made whole. They have a right to compensation. But they don't have the right to be enriched, okay? And the billboard lawyers, plaintiffs' attorneys, do not have the right to get rich off of the unfortunate fact that maybe you were the victim of lawsuit abuse. And what happens is our appellate courts and our legislature, they favor expanding exposure to liability. Now, what does that mean? Well, a case might come before the court with a novel concept that's never been tried before. And they might say, yes, you can sue for that, and you can collect damages for that. Whereas perhaps you thought you were protected from this new and novel cause of action. That makes it more and more likely that your small business or that you as an individual will be the victim of a unfortunate civil lawsuit. Look, all of this harms job creation in Pennsylvania. It diverts resources away from wages, from innovation, from expansion of businesses and providing more jobs. And then what happens is nuclear verdicts are awarded all across the state, but particularly in the city of Philadelphia court system. And a nuclear verdict is loosely defined as any verdict above $10 million that is not tethered in any realistic way to the underlying damages and that sort of thing. So we have an out-of-control civil litigation system that is hurting every one of you and making it more and more likely that you or your companies, your businesses, will be sued.
And there's data to support what Curt was just talking about. When you talk about nuclear verdicts, you also have these what are almost thermonuclear verdicts.
Yeah.
So between 2013 and 2022, there were 115 jury verdicts coming out of Philadelphia of $100 million or more. That's a tremendous amount of money. Just last year, there were 3 eye-popping jury verdicts that came out that I think illustrates Curt's point. Last year, there was a $2.25 billion, not million, billion with a B, jury verdict against Monsanto over Roundup, a pesticide that's commonly used. Lawsuits are being brought against Monsanto, claiming people developed various illnesses. It's all based on junk science, but Philadelphia judges let that science in, shady expert testimony, and so now Monsanto is looking at, trying to appeal a case of $2.25 billion. Also last year, ExxonMobil was hit with an $800 million plus jury verdict in a case involving benzene, which is a chemical that was used, and the plaintiff was, I think, a mechanic in an auto shop. And to illustrate the bias of judges and jurors in Philadelphia, this case, I think, really makes the point. Number one, the judge presiding over the case started talking about climate change and Exxon's actions related to climate change. It had nothing to do with whether the plaintiff was actually injured or harmed by this benzene. And then it came out after the jury verdict that one of the jurors, who's supposed to be impartial, unbiased, had posted on her social media account before the trial that, quote, Exxon is objectively a villain because it's responsible for climate change. Now, how is anyone, let alone Exxon, supposed to get or receive a fair trial with jurors like that? That information was actually brought to the attention. That post was brought to the attention of the judge, and he refused to grant Exxon a new trial. So that's what we're talking about in Philadelphia, where the deck is really stacked against you. And then there was a $1 billion plus jury verdict against Mitsubishi, and I think that case happened at the end of 2023. It involved a car accident. The case, or the accident happened in Bucks County, okay, not in Philadelphia. And yet that case was heard in Bucks County because they know, the plaintiff's lawyers know, that they're more likely to succeed, they're more likely to prevail and get that nuclear verdict if they can get that case in Philadelphia.
Yeah, and that's called venue shopping. You might have heard of the term because there's a lot of that going on at the federal level these days. And we're going to get to that in a moment and show the parallels between what's happening with cases brought against President Trump's executive orders and what happens in Pennsylvania literally every day. Well, Matt, let's look at barriers to reform in Pennsylvania. In my mind, we have two. The courts and the legislature are the biggest barriers to reform. So in the legislatures, the Pennsylvania trial lawyers, the deep-pocketed, tasseled loafer plaintiffs' attorneys, through their political action committees, they prevented needed civil litigation reform in Pennsylvania. They control the Democrats in the legislature, every one. And they have enough influence with a handful of Republicans, okay, in the House and the Senate, so that they've been able to stop meaningful reform that would level the playing field in civil litigation. Now, fortunately, we do have some real proponents and some real stand-up legislators who understand this problem and want to do something about it. Representative Torrin Ecker from Adams County is working on introducing a series of bills in the House. I'll just give you the highlights of a couple of them. They want to, we need to restore the Fair Share Act to its original legislative intent. Fair Share Act, it prevents someone who's only 1% at fault to having to pay 100% of a verdict, okay? In other words, you pay the percentage of the verdict for which you're found at fault. It's a very simple and fair concept. Well, our appellate courts have run holes through it, created loopholes that are, really hurting the act. Another would be to limit the contingency fees of attorneys, have a sliding scale of percentages based on recoveries. Plaintiffs' attorneys do not need to take 40% of the verdict. The less they take, the more the injured plaintiff, their client, is going to be able to be compensated. So I think we need to stop, fueling the beast of the litigation attorneys and worry a little bit more about the client who was actually aggrieved or harmed. But right now they have to give away, a huge amount of their award. Matt, in other states, what can you tell us about what they're doing in this regard, in reform?
Other states are tackling lawsuit abuse. Your competitors, if you look at, think of Pennsylvania as being in competition with other states around the country to attract jobs, investment, and people moving to your state, right? And if you think about tort reform, it's one leg of a three-legged stool. It also includes tax cuts and tax reform and regulatory reform, plus tort reform. And the states that have tackled those are the states that are growing, the states that are thriving economically, places like Texas, Florida, Georgia. All those states have friendly tax environments, regulatory environments, and recently they're starting to tackle lawsuit abuse. 2 years ago in Florida, under the leadership of the great Governor Ron DeSantis, they passed a tremendous tort reform package to rein in these billboard lawyers. I mean, you can't drive more than a tenth of a mile in South Florida without seeing one. Yeah. In Georgia this year, Governor Kemp prioritized tort reform, and they just passed a huge package, again, to rein in lawsuit abuse. In Oklahoma, the conservative governor, Kevin Stitt, has tasked the legislature, again, with tackling these billboard lawyers. But Curt, there's one point I wanted to make.
Yeah.
Why is this important to you? Why should you care? We've talked about Exxon being treated unfairly and other large corporate defendants, but what does it mean to you? Well, there have been some studies done, and there's a tort tax that you all pay. And in Pennsylvania, each individual pays a tort tax every year of $1,400. That's in the form of higher prices for goods and services. So if you think about it, a family of four is paying a tort tax of $5,700. Mm-hmm. That's real money out of your pockets.
Yeah.
It's also been estimated that there's $11.8 billion of personal income that's lost in Pennsylvania every year because of lawsuit abuse, and 171,000 jobs are lost or aren't created because of lawsuit abuse. So this affects everyone, and that's why what we're talking about today is so important, and it really does impact everyone in this room.
And Matt, I would just like to point out the issue of forum shopping and how this plays into nuclear verdicts and what's happening with our healthcare system right now. I mentioned you hear a lot of talk about forum shopping or venue shopping these days because all the left-wing organizations and their attorneys that are challenging President Trump's executive orders, they're shopping all around the country for perhaps an Obama or Biden appointed federal judge in the district courts so that they can take their case there and have the best shot at winning and maybe even getting a nationwide injunction to stop the presidential action. Same thing happens here and has been happening for years in Pennsylvania, particularly in medical malpractice cases. Plaintiffs out there, because of our loose venue rules, they try to bring every case they can in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is the epicenter of nuclear verdicts and high verdicts in general. And they know that, with the jury pool and the verdicts, that they are likely to win and likely to win big. So now we have hospitals, for example, from York, Lancaster, Reading, Scranton even, hauled into, what is really a very hostile Philadelphia court system. And how does that impact you? Well, the cost of medicine goes up. The cost of the physician's insurance and your insurance goes up. And if it gets as bad as it did in the early 2000s, you will see medical services go away, especially in some of the specialists, what they consider high-risk specialists here in Pennsylvania. So, Matt, I guess the other angle, other than the courts that we need to talk about, is, what cases are we watching in the court? And I can tell you that there's one that really scares me to death and should be of concern to all of you. It's called Freilich versus SEPTA. The Supreme Court had arguments on it a few weeks ago. And if the plaintiff's attorney, Klein Inspector, that name might be familiar to some of you. It's his son, it's the late senator's son. I'll just say the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. But they've brought a case to strike down as unconstitutional the limits or the caps on damages against your boroughs that you live in, your townships, your school districts, your counties. So if that is successful and these lawsuits against them become uncapped, well, the sky is the limit, and you as taxpayers will be the ones on the hook. And in many instances, these rural small townships that I know many of you live in, they'll have to go bankrupt. So this is a very important case before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that we all have a lot at stake at, and that's, like I said, just a case that I believe we should look out for.
So Curt, judges are elected in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And they're, at the local level and so forth. What can voters do?
Well, when a judge is elected to the Supreme Court, you might know that they get a 10-year term, okay? That's a competitive election. It's usually a Republican versus a Democrat. Well, once they've served the 10-year term, they are up for what's called a retention vote, okay? And that vote is just up or down on a yes or no on whether the judge should be retained and serve another 10 years on the Supreme Court. Well, in 2015, there were 3 judges elected with the support of the trial bar, the plaintiff's attorneys, who spent millions of dollars getting them elected. All 3 of them are up for retention later this year. So I would just say for right now, educate yourselves on the justices and other court levels that are up for retention, and you, the voters, are going to have your say on whether you want to keep them on the bench or whether you think a change is needed. And finally, Matt, I would just say we need to elect a pro reform majority to the House, and Senate. We're not going to get our legislative changes that we needed to thwart a lot of the bad court decisions that have come down in the past few years that harms medicine, that harms your business, that subjects you to a greater chance of being sued until we put reform-oriented people in the legislature.
Well, I think we're out of time, Curt. We really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.